and if you have that mindset, like you just described, there's a whole that opens up a new world about reusability.
Welcome to the LabVIEW experiment. I am your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. In my 15 years of working with and training developers, I've had the opportunity to conduct a lot of experiments. Over here, we believe in embracing failure as the essential learning experience that it is. And what better way to learn than from other people's mistakes? In this podcast, I talk to industry experts, colleagues, and friends about their failures and how they have turned them into future successes. So, welcome to the LabVIEW experiment. I am here with Niko and Naredi, and we're going to talk today about DevOps, but we're going to kind of change up the format a little bit. And first, I'm going to ask the question that I like to ask at the end, and that is, tell me about an experiment that you tried that didn't go the way you thought it would, and what did you learn?
So thanks a lot for that question, and I'm happy to be on the podcast. So when we start projects, they can be really any type, more or less. And I recently came into a project where they asked for testers. So me and a colleague of mine were staffed for a half a year for a Swiss industry customer, and the company, which I won't name because that experiment failed, and so I won't drop names here. They produce mainly machines for hobbyists and professionals, so somewhere along that line. And we were there really employed as pure software testers because their new flagship device was already delayed by a year and a half, more or less. And so their tech stack was really a C++ on a microcontroller, and they had a second controller with a GUI and a Linux for the touch panel stuff and for the connection for an IoT device and so on. And we were there as software testers, and we were supposed to write tests based on when we click a button, and we could programmatically click buttons and then see what the machine did and so on. And in the end, so in retrospective, it was really a stereotypical setup for a fail because they had produced those types of machine for 70 years, more or less. And so there were no requirements for that new machine because, I mean, all the whole company did was producing those machines for 70 years. So of course they know how to, what the machine should do. But in the end, when you write a new software for a new flagship device, you should know what you've been doing, right? And there was also no documentation because they had a team of 15 people and 3 architects, and those 3 architects had together in their career more than 80 years combined experience in that company, and so everything was in the architect's head. So, and they were cool people. So if you didn't know a thing, you would go to them and ask them something, and they would reply, and it was very nice. But there was also there were no requirements, no documentation, and there were also no tests because their former CEO always said, look, as a programmer, you are a good programmer if you're coding without bugs. So we don't need tests because we only have the best programmers that are around. And so, of course, such machines have to be tested, and they had a fleet of testers actually. So they would code their stuff, ship it to the testers, and they had like 30 or 40 people doing the testing and then coming back to the development team and saying, look, these are the bugs that we found. So there was sort of tests, but only manual testing. And I mean, having that is really expensive no matter where those people sit, right? And so they came up with a different solution and said, look, we are going to test, but we're going to introduce a web server on the GUI. And when you press a button and you see what the machine does, or there should be a different GUI popping up, you can also do a web request and see what comes back. So we were there only to write these GUI tests. The problem with that is it didn't help a lot because when you're pressing a button on a GUI and it goes down all the way to the low level stuff and you're getting something back that is, I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong in the meantime. So nobody wanted, to debug it because it was a mess. We could only raise our hand and say, look, there's a bug. Yeah. So, and what's really cool, or what we thought would help, there was a new CTO, and they had the ingenious thought that switching from their waterfall to Scrum would solve the problem. Because when you employ Scrum, everything gets better magically. And so what they chose as their tool was Jira, of course. So they had that. And the thing why it really didn't help, to spoiler already a bit, was because the change was not driven by the people, but by the executive management who simply imposed it from the top. And even if you hire an external Scrum Master who has no idea about the subject matter, it basically doesn't help, because even bringing us on board, we were able to test the feature after it was completed, and the card was done on the Jira board, right? That means we have to step up after the feature is already completed, and say, look, we can't put the card to complete it because there's a bug there. So we were the ones delaying constantly every progress, saying, look, it's not done. There is something wrong there. And that led to the fact that, first of all, we were withdrawn from the project, because we were the two testers of us, we were withdrawn from the project, saying, look, you guys delay only stuff. You're not helping us by testing. You're making us slower. But in the end, it turned out that that project got overhauled completely, and redone from scratch with a delay of more than 3 years estimated to the future now. And if you think about it, I mean, that means we were on there half a year. And if a company has the resources to waste people's work for more than a year so far already with 15 people, there's not so many companies with a decent size that can do that more often than once before they're never going to do that again, right?
Yeah.
Because they run out of business. And so I think from that example, there are a lot of things to learn in there.
Yeah, I was taking a few notes. So you want to go over my notes?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm glad to hear what you
I know
think.
kind of 4 points going through there. The first one that I noted was when you were talking. I mean, there's probably way more to go into there, and we will. But one of the things I noticed, you mentioned the GUI testing and it being very hard. And I imagine the hard part is pinpointing where exactly the problem is, right? Because
Exactly.
Okay, I've got this DMM and it's supposed to show the reading on the screen. How many layers of the software does it go through before it gets to the screen, and which one's messing up? And the GUI test tells you there's something wrong, but it doesn't exactly tell you where.
Yeah.
Whereas if you had like more fine-tuned unit tests at each layer, then you could kind of pinpoint like, okay, this layer it's not getting through because we did something wrong.
They even had a guy who did draw like the testing scenario how it should be, and he said, look, we have our testing pyramid, we have unit tests, we should have unit tests, we should have integration tests, and then we have end-to-end tests, right? And the real funny thing was that they refused to do unit testing because they said, so their mantra had so long been that you simply don't code with bugs, that they said this is a waste of time. I simply want to code. I don't want to write tests. I want to code. And also, you can't fire people when they have all their knowledge in their head, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was really the worst part of it, because even high up the ladder, nobody could say, look, we have to get rid of these guys because they are standing in the way of progress. Because you can't, they have all the documentation, everything of the architecture is in their heads. And so I think, yeah, you're completely spot on with the debugging.
Actually, as you were saying that, the very first thing that popped in my head when you started talking was when you mentioned the 80 years of experience. And I immediately thought they haven't thought of the lottery problem, or whatever you want to call it, right? Like somebody wins the lottery, it just disappears. Like they take 30 years of knowledge and it's not written down anywhere. That's just kind of crazy.
Yeah. So that was really a huge thing for them.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think that you just hit on, that wasn't on my original list, but viewing coding and testing as two separate activities, I think is like a large part of the problem, especially like consultants and stuff, because we go in and we say, oh, we're gonna do this, and sometimes I see people make the mistake of they make a separate line item for writing the code and a separate line item for writing the tests, and that's like
Yeah,
immediate no because the first thing that the company's going to do is say, well, we don't want tests, scratch that one. We're not paying you to
yeah.
do that. We're paying you to write the code, and you should write it right the first time. And exactly what you're talking about.
So I think we have stopped that quite a while ago, that when we write an offer as consultants, we don't write the testing in there anymore. We simply expand the item in its duration, or
Yep.
the amount of money that we take for, or we estimate for it, and say in the end, look, this includes everything, and silently include the tests anyway.
Yeah, I think that's nicer for the customer too, though, because they just want one number at the end of the day anyway. So if you can just give them one number, I think that
Yeah,
helps, and it
yeah.
prevents some of that micromanagement stuff from going on.
But
So
that also depends a lot of about the fact how much trust you have with the customer, right?
yeah,
When you have a new customer and you need like to build, or to really write down each item that you're going to do, then it's different compared to a customer where you have years of relationship and they know you.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but
Those
I
are
think
definitely
it's
the
a
customers.
consultant problem.
Yeah, those are definitely the customers that you want. Ideally, yeah. The other thing I was thinking too with when you're talking about testing at the GUI is like how long, like what's the delay from the time that you write that bug, right? If the bug is in the low level hardware driver, it might be a long time before you get the whole thing written to the point where that shows up in the GUI and that value is in the GUI, and somebody notices that hey, it's spitting out the wrong value.
Yeah.
And trying not just like so many things to sift through, but also so much time has passed that like going back to something you did several months ago is often very difficult.
I mean, they also had a constant shift of people below those architects, and so often those people that wrote the thing were not there anymore. So nobody, and since they were not forced to, or not held accountable to produce documentation, um, they, there was nothing there. So you had to go through all the code, no matter how good, no matter how bad it was. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and then I got a few more points too. Another one is when you mentioned the top-down thing. That's one of the reasons I kind of dislike all of the agile frameworks, like Safe and Scrum and all of them, because I don't think they're bad ideas necessarily. Well, Safe I think is a horrible idea, but
yeah.
Scrum I don't think is a bad idea. If the team decides that's the way they want to work, like I think
Mhm.
that's fine. But the problem is, as you said, they always bring in somebody from the outside and they try to impose it top down, and it just I very rarely see that work out well. Because I
Yeah.
think part of it is like you need that like mindset shift, and when it's imposed top down, the people don't really change the way they think at all.
Yeah.
Like they have to change
I
the way they think and then invite it in.
I'm completely with you. When I joined Züge after I was at NI, I I took my first Scrum course like a couple months after I joined, and it felt nice. It was a cool training. We had these Lego bricks where we had like short sprints and could build something, and then had retrospectives, and it felt all okay, but it felt like somebody came up with that framework
Mhm.
and then made a blueprint out of it, and all of a sudden that blueprint should fit everywhere.
Yep.
And that's not the way it works, right? It's every company is different. um may it be consulting or not consulting company. So this feels like somebody, it worked once and all of a sudden it should work everywhere. I'm not saying that having a daily stand-up is a bad idea. That's not what I'm saying, but I, I I think you have to take the best parts of it that fit to your company or your team, and then adapt from there.
Yeah, I think sometimes people like I think it appeals to people who like rules and are rules followers, and like we just follow the rules and we go through the motions and somehow it suddenly gets better. And if you're doing daily stand-ups and they're not adding value, then why are you doing them? And if you're doing them just
Yeah,
because some guy says you should, well, then you should probably stop doing that. So, yeah.
I also had a company where I joined as consultant where they said, well, we're doing 2 week sprints because that's how you're supposed to be doing sprints in 2 week basis. And I'm like, yep, guys, we are a hardware producing company. There are so many things that within 2 weeks can happen where a part gets delayed. You're not able to do anything because you're relying on some hardware stuff, which is simply different to the software engineering world where you only produce software artifacts and we don't. You produce an electronics board and you have to wait till you get it shipped to you. It might get stuck at customs. There might be different things. So probably a 3 week or 4 week sprint cycle might be a lot better. And they said, no, we're sticking to 2 weeks. And then they failed consequently their sprint goal. And as soon as you keep on failing your sprint goal all the time, you don't value it anymore because there is nothing that tells you, well, it's cool, or there's no good feeling associated with completing the tasks that you set as a goal.
Yeah, yeah, I can see the missing the sprinkle being very demoralizing. Like you say you're going to do this thing and then you don't do it. I am much more a fan in general of the Kanban type method. So we still meet like every week or every 2 weeks, but we just have a priority list that we pull from, and the meeting is basically just to make sure that the priorities are still right.
Yeah.
So very rarely do we have a goal like this week we're going to get this done and that done and that done. We're like, we're going to work on these two or three things and we should get these done. But if we don't, it's not as big a deal because it's just kind of like psychologically setting yourself up for success, I guess.
Yeah. Instead of setting yourself up for failure, and when you know you're going to fail anyway, where's the point?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's definitely true. The other thing I noticed when we were talking, you mentioned about testing after like the card's already done in Jira and it's already been complete. And that led to two things. One is that once you mentally decide that it's complete, it's really hard to get people to go back and change things. And so a lot of things get let go, right? Like a lot of, and maybe some of them are little things like style and like, oh, well, you did it this way, but there's a slightly better way to do it. And maybe that's okay. But the other thing I think that goes into that is like, what does it mean for a card to actually be done? Like people don't talk about that enough. Like it's done. Okay. Does that mean it works on my computer? Does that mean that I've built
Yeah.
it? The actual final product is built and the customers tested it? Does it mean that the documentation's done? Like there's a lot
Yeah.
that goes into that word.
So if so, the Scrum Master was talking all the day about definition of done, but they couldn't agree on anything within the team. Saying, look, there's not enough time and so on, because you have this constant pressure from story points being taken down on some graph versus time or money spent leveling up on some point. And we as testers always came along. So look, we're not taking that issue down from the board because it's not done. There is not. And then the PM came along, look, we're not making enough progress and so on. And you're like, I don't care about this graph, I care about the usability of a certain feature. And if it's not usable to me, it's not done. You don't want to ship a product that is not done in my eyes.
Yeah, I think that speaks to like misaligned incentives, right? What is the project manager being incentivized on? If they're being incentivized on those nice clean graphs that go one direction and like meeting all their targets, instead of do we actually deliver something that's useful to the customer and does what they need it to do?
I completely agree. So the thing that I find very, or one key takeaway from this was really for me, um, when you take away the within a team can't own their business problem, and is not, you're not flowing the consequences of your action towards the people that do these actions, um, then you're introducing bad quality by default. So what I mean by that is when my boss makes a promise and I don't keep it and I get punished, that's a bad thing. Versus I have an idea and some entitled jerk up the ladder gets the credit for it, then that's also not a good thing. So if I make, what it should be is I make a mistake and I get called at 3 a.m. in the night saying, look, in the 3 8 hours shift, there's something wrong at 3 a.m. in the morning, and I have to fix it. So that the consequences, so also especially the bad consequences, flow to people that make the decisions. But it's really human and understandable that people flow away bad, so bad consequences, but direct good consequences to themselves. And I think that's the essence of DevOps. You flow consequences towards power and not away from it. Because when you apply that, you create more good consequences and fewer bad ones. But the difficulty with making, or applying that DevOps thinking is that the status quo in many, many companies has evolved to avoid the flow of consequences. And I think there it takes really stern and unyielding leadership in a way to rewire how organizations work and flow the consequences always towards power and not away from it.
No, I think that's great. I had a conversation with Llewellyn Falco the other day on Software Engineering Radio. Maybe Taylor can throw the link in the show notes. But we talked about approval testing, but he was talking about testing in general and how it's about this idea of the people who have the control and make the decisions that cause the pain need to feel the pain, because if they don't feel it, then there's this disconnect, and it's hard to get motivated to change your behavior because somebody else is in pain. It's much easier to be motivated to change behavior
exactly.
when you're the one feeling the pain.
Yeah. It's really that mindset shift, which I think is hard, especially when you have something imposing from the top and then saying, look, I say we do that, but there's also stern consequences for me and for my actions. And I'm pretty sure nobody intuitively likes that. It's, as you said, it's way easier if those testing people, like, I don't know where they were in Eastern Europe somewhere, if they have to do the same tests over and over again and report the same thing back over and over again that there's a bug, compared to me and myself, like you said, digging down through 20 layers of code, seeing where that thing is, and fixing it on the spot.
Yeah, I think that goes back to our previous discussion of the top-down thing not working. I think the main reason is because they make the decisions at the top, but they never actually feel the pain at the bottom that those changes impose, and that just causes resentment and causes friction, and then people don't necessarily want to do it. Whereas if they make the decision to do it themselves and it incurs some pain, because every time you change something, you pick up a new way of working or something, there's some pain associated with that.
Yeah.
And if you choose it, it's much better than if somebody else chooses it for you.
Exactly. I don't know who said that. I don't know if it was on your podcast or if I heard it somewhere else. But when it comes to software engineering, if it hurts, do it more often. I think there's some. It's not a rule for sports, but for software engineering, for a deployment, for example, we had the issue with a different customer where deployment was a huge mess because we couldn't access the machines, and if you made a mistake, there was like tons of things that could happen. But once you automate that and take, like, the more often you have to do it, the more you think about how to build in quality that you're not messing up the production line, or you're not driving one axis into the wall, and make sure that you're hitting all the quality criteria. So the more you automate when it comes, for example, to deployment, the safer you are in the end.
Yeah, I noticed in the Labby world where some of us are on board with the continuous integration part of running the tests and doing the building, but there's a lot of resistance to the deployment part. Can you talk more about that and how you've made that work in the Labby world?
I don't have I don't have a golden key on to make, or we're still really also struggling there. One idea that we have and that we are starting is working with the NI package manager for also test stand deployments, for examples.
Mm-hmm.
we started utilizing that, but there's not, like when you look at all these continuous deployment tools that other people out there use, you're simply blown away by the tools that they have at their hands, where they simply push something and it's off and it's fine. Um, I haven't seen that really working. I don't know what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anybody in the library world really attempt that a lot. I think there's some reticence, partially because we deal with real world things. We deal with pumps and valves and motors and dangerous things that could cause problems. So I think there's some caution, which is probably warranted.
Hmm.
I think our customers are very cautious, which is maybe also warranted. I really like the idea of having if you can have a test system that you can just deploy
Yes.
constantly, and then you can have people doing those GUI tests and things, and because those are still valuable, even though they're not necessarily always the easiest ones to debug or whatever. You still want to know about those problems, but being able
I,
to do
I'm
that, I think, is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think you're really right there, because what I'm really envious of is when software people, they talk about blue-green deployment, right? So what you do is you have two identical systems, and you have one production system that's online, and you have an identical system that's a spare part, let's say, and you're deploying everything to that system that's not online yet, um, and running all your tests, all your production tests, seeing whether that works. And then you simply have a load balancer switching over from from the green deployment to the blue deployment, and switching their status. And if it fails, you simply switch back, So within 30 or 50 milliseconds, you see it's working, it's not working. And the user doesn't necessarily see a glitch in the matrix, because, I mean, if a homepage loads 30 or 50 milliseconds slower or faster, I mean, who notices most of the time, right? Um, and we don't have that luxury usually, because we don't have test systems where we can freely try out whatever we want and then deploy to the real thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't. The other thing too, I think the interesting pattern is which is very similar, is like the strangler fig pattern, where you send it to both of them and you compare the output. And as long as they're the same, you keep sending it out. If it disagrees, you send out the old one or something like that.
Exactly.
And then eventually at some point you just realize that hey, we can get rid of the old one and the new one's doing the same thing.
Yeah, but I mean, this is something where we where so I mean, this is really part of what the CD part in DevOps looks at. So they have different things, right? They also have stuff like canary releases, where you only release features to a subset of users. But I mean, how often do we have one production machine? And so a subset of one in
Yeah.
integers won't be lower than one, right? So
Yeah. Well, also too, depending on what type of testing you're doing, I've done some stuff where it's destructive testing. Like you have a sample and when you process it, it goes away, right? So how can you process that on two separate machines?
yeah,
Like we were doing one where we were doing circuit board testing, and in that you could run the circuit board through the known good machine, run it through the second machine, compare the results. Like that worked,
yeah.
as long as you didn't do anything crazy and blow anything up on the circuit board. But generally, that's supposed to be a non-destructive test.
So I think on the CD side, it's really tough for us, because also the OT world is not necessarily as connected yet as the IT world. So oftentimes, we would struggle to simply access machines for an update, or there would be no connection from the old days of the SVN server or a Git server to the machine. So we can't simply say, look, there's a new tag, pull all the code that is on a new tag. So you had to do a manual diff in between tags and go there, copy the files, shut down the machine or the running program, and then copy over the files. And I think this is where the NI package manager can help, because they can then really deploy those files automatically, and you don't introduce manual error in there.
Yeah, no, I think automating that as much as you can is a useful thing. I used to work for Westinghouse, and we would build stuff for nuclear reactors, and some of the stuff went inside containment. And so those you could only get in there several times a year if you were lucky, and and they weren't shutting down the reactor just so you could go update software. So that
No,
that was pretty.
probably not.
That was definitely one of
Yeah,
those situations where we had a test machine, and we definitely. I think part of the key is being able to deploy quickly. So I talked to this guy at the software conference, and he was talking about some retail thing, and they were working with this retailer, and they only let them deploy like once a month on a very specific day at midnight or whatever, and from like Thanksgiving through Christmas they couldn't do anything. And of course this website was always having problems because they would batch up a whole month's worth of change and then make them all at once, and if there were problems it was hard to tell which one caused the problem, and sort
yeah.
through them, things like that. And
It,
and how do you convince somebody like that to allow you to deploy more often? I think part of it is, they don't want any changes from December through January. But what if they found a bug in the middle of December that was giving away stuff for free, right? They would want that fixed really quick.
yeah.
So the key is to then figure out how can we get to the point where maybe we don't deploy it really quickly all the time, but we have that ability that we can turn something around in half an hour or something. Because to me, the biggest change in my LabVIEW development was starting to do more of the CI/CD and test-driven development stuff, and get to the point where a customer can call me, and if the fix is simple, I can fix it in half an hour and have them a build on their machine that's running,
Yeah.
and it's like a press of a button, and that's really huge because I feel like most LabVIEW developers don't have that.
Yeah. I'm really with you. I mean, funnily for the audience to know, I mean, this is also how we got in contact, right? Because you were posting about your CI course
Yep.
On LinkedIn, and why I actually contacted you was I was with a customer project on Python, and there I found a library which is called Cookie Cutter, which I find anyway a nice name for a library. But what that does is basically it's a starting point, full of best practices for a project. Let's say you're building a library for a DAC device for a DMM. And what we always do, I mean, we have an internal LabVIEW template, right? Where most of the things with a pre-build and a post-build VI to execute is already in there, and it's a good starting point. But what the cookie cutter library does is there's a makefile in there, and it asks you questions like, who are you? What's your email address? What is the server you're planning to deploy on? Is it GitHub? Is it GitLab? Is it Azure DevOps? What is it? Are you planning a CI pipeline? Which test suites do you want to run? Do you go with PyTest? Do you go with unit test framework? And it sets up everything automatically from the name of the package down to the library that would do the documentation for you. And so every time you do a new project, you will have the exact same thing with the exact same quality, with best practices that have been collected out there over the years. And this is actually why I contacted you, because that was what I was actually internally looking for to build, having a starting point with a CI and CD setup that basically you don't have to start from scratch. And I don't think that there's anything comparable for LabVIEW out there yet.
Yeah, I have a template that I use, but it's not that sophisticated, and it doesn't have that prompting that you go through. One of my goals is to try to start a CI/CD as a service or something, because I feel like in LabVIEW, the hard part of the CI/CD thing is the setting up the runners and making sure they connect to the server and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite difficult. And so having something where a customer could come and they say, I'm on GitLab, here's my project, here's the API key, set me up a runner for LabVIEW with these versions of LabVIEW and test stand and whatever installed, and just make it work. That would be really valuable, because that takes a lot of time. And then to your point, I think on top of that, having a thing that would then script the CI file itself to say, run these, I use Karaya for my unit testing. I want to generate anti-doc documentation. This is where I want to publish it. That would also be very valuable. So
I mean, when looking at other programming languages, it sometimes blows my mind what you get out of the box.
Yep.
And you're spending 2 minutes in your terminal answering those questions. You run them for the first time, or you upload it, you do a git push, and all of a sudden you see a succeeded build email coming back from GitHub that your newly made project had already the first successful build. That's that's actually a really cool feeling that you don't have to configure any runner. I mean, also the Python checkout is being done compared to what you just said, setting up a manual runner for LabVIEW, which I did last week, and it simply takes forever. And I even tried scripting it, going with the NI package manager and going through that documentation, trying
That's
to understand
painful.
what do I have to insert. There's not a list of the NI packages out there. I
Nope.
have to install NI LabVIEW 2023 Q3 manually to see the feed which is registered to
Yep.
see the name of the package, and then I can automate it. And it's like, guys, what the heck? Publish, please, something that I can work with.
Yeah, I've been after NI to do that for a while, so hopefully somebody from NI who actually has some authority is listening to this and will go change that. I kind of doubt it, but maybe. There's always hope. But yeah, the future of LabVIEW is kind of what concerns me about setting up this whole CI/CD thing, because like setting all of this up would be a big service and useful to the LabVIEW community. But the problem is like that type of service doesn't work for any other programming language because no other programming language needs it. As you mentioned, like every other programming language, every other text-based programming language I've ever worked with, like setting up CI/CD is like 5 minutes and it just works and it runs. And LabVIEW, it's like just, I had this conversation with Nancy, like just imagine like, okay, you're a programmer, you've never tried LabVIEW, right? And you want to try LabVIEW. How difficult is that? Now think about like, okay, you never used Python before, but somebody says it's Python. Okay, what do you have to do? Well, if you're on Linux or Mac, all you have to do is open up a text window, type in print hello world, save it as .py and run it with Python and it runs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? LabVIEW, there's no similar experience to that. There's nothing. You have to go to ni.com, you have to go enter your email, then you have to go confirm your email, then you have to go find the download page, select the right version, you have to download it, then you have to install NI package manager and wait for that to load, then you have to install LabVIEW, and then you finally get LabVIEW to run. And what does it come up with? Oh, now you've got to go register and you got to log into ni.com, and right? And it's this whole like rigmarole that like it's so painful.
Yeah.
And even like, as you were saying, like setting up a runner for CI takes me like maybe an hour to get everything set up and running. And in Python, if I want if I want to run something, if I'm using GitLab and I want to run something in Python 3.11 or whatever, all I do is I type, image Python 3.11, done. Right? It launches the Docker container, it runs, it shuts down. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to set up any machine. I don't have to do any API keys.
It simply, when I did that, so there were, in my software engineering career, there were a few moments where it really blew my mind how cool it is. The first one was when I started unit testing. That was the first time I had a project with a database and I had no idea about SQL. And I that's when I decided, look, I'm going really to test every function. And I could so securely deploy what I did because I had the tests in the background to know what it did.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the first noticeable moment in my software career where I said, look, this is mind blowing. And the second was the first time I did, like you said, a Python YAML file for Azure DevOps, and it simply worked. Like 2 minutes after I started working, I got it running on the cloud, and it's like, how easy is that?
Yeah, well, so that unit testing, I think, is one of those things that I find it's such a shame that we don't teach people that. Like you take LabVIEW Core 1 and Core 2 and you don't learn unit testing. Mm-hmm. And I have found unit testing, like, okay, it brings a lot of benefits to your software projects and stuff, but it brings a lot of benefits personally because that's how I learn new things. Like every time I learn a new language, the first thing I want to know is how do I write a test?
Yeah.
Right? Because I know what I want to do. Like I want to do this array sorting algorithm or whatever, but how do I know that it actually does what I think it does? Right? Like I write out the syntax, I look it up and I'm like, okay, but what does it exactly do? And if I can write a unit test, then I can prove it to myself. Like this is exactly what it does. And it makes a lot of sense. And so I feel like it helps you learn more than anything else. Yeah.
So to be very honest, I have never done a project where I really purely work test driven, where I said I write the test first and then I'll implement. This is not how my brain really works, but I think the benefit in test driven development is that you think about testability. What goes into your function and what goes out of your function, and then you think, can I test it or can I not test it? And I think it's not so much like sticking to that ritual of writing the test first or writing your code first, but thinking about, is that thing that I do, is that testable or is it not testable? And I think this makes all of the difference when it comes to unit testing and test-driven development.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned hardware, and the analogy I always use is, when I worked at Westinghouse, we used to test circuit boards, and they would have 4-layer circuit boards. And if the person designing it did not think about testing, all the signals were buried in the middle layers, and you couldn't get access to them. And so, how do you validate that the output of this gate is correct? Well, you can't, because it's buried and it's connected to 10 other things. And so,
Yeah.
So just being able to think about your software in that way, software has layers, and if you want something exposed, you have to make it a point to expose it. And
Yeah.
So thinking along those lines, there's something interesting. So I've been doing a lot of Python lately. In Python, the typing is very different than in LabVIEW, and they have different, like, they don't have this idea of private or public or protected, right? Everything's just kind of like out there, and there's like some
we are consenting others here,
Yeah.
however you like it.
Well, I actually like that because I ran into this problem. So I was using LUnit recently, this new unit testing framework. I don't know if you've used it. It's
No.
quite nice. I like it. Antoine Sundqvist, he's over in Europe somewhere.
Yeah.
And it's basically a modern version of VI Tester.
Yeah.
Tester hasn't been touched in a while. And it's great, but the assert methods, like the pass if true or fail or whatever, they're all, in the older version, they were all protected.
Mhm.
Right? Because he was thinking, oh, well, you only ever call them inside the thing. But I wanted to make this like utility library that sat like outside of a test class that we would wrap some of those to add some extra error handling and some stuff. And I couldn't do that because they were protected. So basically, I had to like create a child class that was a decorator and jump through all these hoops. And I could still call them, but it required jumping through all these hoops. And I was talking to somebody and they're like, yeah, like that's why we don't do that in Python. Like, because generally, like when people need to call that, they're not doing it like maliciously, and they're not like, they have a very good reason. And you, by making it private, have just made them jump through all these hoops.
Yeah. I that's really what it's cool for. I mean, on the other hand, one thing that when I start seeing code at my colleagues and it's not statically typed in Python, it always gives me shivers, So this is, I think, like the one of the big drawbacks that you have to go through when you come from a LabVIEW world, which is statically typed. Then you really have to say, look, Python doesn't care what you hand over in terms of types of parameters when you call a function, whether it's a bool or whether it's an integer. You will get an error later, and I want to know already in the IDE, is that correct or is it not? And this is, I think, one of the nice features in LabVIEW, that it immediately breaks, right? You can't run it.
Yeah, that is actually quite nice. The thing, definitely, if you're using Python, I highly recommend type hints. That does help somewhat. It still doesn't prevent things from going wrong, but it definitely helps.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also there, when it comes to deployment, because we talked about that earlier, it's really the fact that I have a tool and I can simply say publish, whatever that tool may be, and all of a sudden, all I have to do is provide an access key for PyPy or PyPI, and it's there as a package, and somebody else can use that package if it's a public package, or I have a private repository and it's on there in my Azure DevOps feed, and I can simply say from my CI runner, look, for anybody else out there in my team, take it, simply connect to that feed and also take it. This is so easy when it comes to the deployment that I don't see how we can be so straightforward without using system link, which where the entrance barrier money-wise is simply so high that I haven't seen a customer successfully integrating it into their workflow.
Yeah, System Link is quite expensive. I've been using VIPM, and it works really well for building packages. For the distribution, it's not as easy as PyPy, but it's actually not that bad. I mean, you still have to manually go to the web page and say upload, but basically that's all there is to it. And so I was actually quite surprised at how easy it was because
Hmm.
I published some stuff in the old days on the NI Tools Network. I don't know if you've ever dealt with
No,
that, but
I haven't done that. I've gone
yeah.
through that
Well,
pain.
imagine the worst of NI bureaucracy, and that's pretty close to what you got there because it was just like, you send them an email and it'd take like 3 months to get an answer, and you're just like, really? What, like, yeah,
Uh,
it was pretty horrible. And you had to jump
but
through all these hoops and you had to pass all these tests and reviews in order to get stuff published. And now with VIPM.io, it's pretty simple and straightforward.
th this is true. So when I published my first package there, it's really easy. But do you publish also like um, artifacts for so when things are, for example, done? Do you use VIPM there as well? So for let's say a private VIPM feed for an executable for a customer, do you use that as well? Because I haven't gone into that direction.
No, yeah, I don't use it for anything like that. For distributing stuff to customers, what I do right now is I use GitLab. And
Hmm.
GitLab has a package manager, so I just build NI packages and I upload them there.
Hmm.
And then in the code itself, you can use the GitLab API to check and see what the latest release is, and I just like
Hmm.
compare numbers. And then if it's newer, I pop up a dialog box and say, "Hey, there's a newer version. Click here to download it," and then they
Yeah.
install it. I
Yeah.
haven't got to like automating the installs yet. Casey has a way to do that. Uh, the automating the installs is kind of tricky because you have to have, instead of launching your application, you have to launch a launcher that then knows where the feed is and goes and gets it. Because otherwise, from within the application, you can't install the new package because it's already in use.
Yeah.
So there's some
Um,
trickery there.
I had a customer who built that, but and I think it's really cool. I mean, the thing is, it's not fast because when you're working with stuff like Visual Studio Code, you start it, then there's a small pop-up, new version found. Do you want to install? And you're simply restarting and I don't know, within 5 seconds you're good to go, right?
Mhm.
But contacting whenever you go via the NIPM, the NIPM feed manager,
Mhm.
that usually takes time because the package manager has to start in the background and then apply a new package and so on. So the user experience is not really identical, but I really like it. For example, when you're working in production and saying, look, there's a new version where a bug is fixed and the user can't execute the old version anymore because you query before with the launcher that and it's not, or it's forbidden by the database to use that special version. And I think there's real value to that mechanism.
Yeah, no, I definitely need to play around with NIPM more and figure out more about how to use it. I know the bare minimum. I know Jim Kring's working on some interesting stuff with Dragon. I don't know if you've been playing around with that, but apparently now it manages like NIPM and VIPM packages or something.
Okay.
That might just be the beta version, but that will be
I
very.
I had it installed, but I I have never really tested it properly, I have to admit.
Well, the challenge with a lot of that stuff, and even like the LabVIEW betas and stuff, is in order to really test them, you have to use them on a project. But if it's a beta version, you don't want to use it on a project because you don't want to hose your customers' stuff. So it's like it's this catch 22.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I mean our time, I whenever I listen to your podcast and there's somebody on like Quentin, for example, and they do so much stuff for the community, I I always find it so inspiring how much time people of their free time they invest because I don't know where these guys they must be, some sort of wizards that they take so much time or have so much time because at the end of a working day I'm like I get home and then there's still family, which I enjoy a lot, but I don't I find it so cool that people invest into such tools, and sometimes I think we or I don't know how I would manage it, and that's why I admire those people a lot that put so much into the community.
Yeah, Quentin is an anomaly, so I would not take Quentin as like the standard, but he'll be happy that you called him a wizard because he's very fond.
That's true, but that was not it was not intentionally. But now that I think about it, it's there might be a Harry Potter reference in there.
Yeah, I
But
mean, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of the people that do a lot of that community stuff are kind of like myself. When you're self-employed, you have a little bit more control over your time, and you're not under as much pressure all the time. So that does make it a little bit easier to do some community stuff. And I
Yeah.
think doing community stuff is a great way to advertise and get your name out there. So, you can spend a bunch of money on advertising, or you can go contribute to some community project and also
Mhm.
raise your name. And the other thing too is a lot of us who do these things on our own, a lot of those projects are like projects that like I would do for work anyway. So like all the CI/CD course and all that stuff that I came up with, that was all me. Like I was working on a real project, and this customer's like, "Hey, you can play around with whatever you want. You want to try new things." I was like, "Great, I'm going to set up this CI/CD server." And so I set it up and I documented everything, and then out of that came a course. But like I didn't set out necessarily to create a course, but just kind
But
of
I think it's also a mindset, like creating things for reuse. Because sometimes we think, well, this request from a customer is so specific, we need a custom solution. But probably a reuse solution gets you like 90% of the way. And then you can ask the customer, do you really have these edge use cases where the last 10% to make it like really fulfill your criteria, that will cost you 90% more than when you take the thing out of the box, right?
yeah.
So, and if you have that mindset, like you just described, there's a whole that opens up a new world about reusability.
Yeah, I think it's always important. I often encourage people like if you can solve your problem without writing any new code, that's probably the better way to go, right? Like, it, if it's just like a procedure problem or a process problem, like fix that instead of writing
Yeah.
code, or use the existing code because it's already out there. It's been tested. Every time you write code, there's risk that it doesn't work, that there's a bug, that it doesn't do what you think it does, like those types of issues,
Yeah,
and
I'm
you have to
completely
maintain
with
it.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's to circle back somehow to the DevOps topic. So what we do as a company when we go and try to introduce DevOps at the customer is the first thing, we're not talking, we're just sitting down and say, look, tell us how information and work flows through your system. So from the moment you enqueue work somewhere, or you say, look, this is a feature we need, up to the point that it's getting deployed into production. How is the procedure that information and work gets there? That is basically a value stream that you also visualize, right?
Mhm.
So and when you do that, it it helps to identify bottlenecks in your system, because when you say, look, I want that feature and it takes 250 days till my feature is in production, but actually people are working actively only like 10 days on it because that's the real working time, and all the rest there's information flowing back and forth, but no real work done, then you know that probably you're talking not about the problem that the feature might bring or the coding, what it might cost, but actually that your system is processing new things way too slow. And I think there's real value also in the DevOps thought that you're you're taking like the real information, how information flows through your system until from start to end, and what you do with the information you gain out of that. And I think this is important because it's not, like you said, it's not always about code. Sometimes it's you simply see, hey, the process that you're following at the moment is way too slow, or it's wrong, the wrong people are involved, stuff like that. I think this is a very important point.
Yeah, you're gonna like. I did an interview, and it hasn't been out yet. By the time this gets out, it'll been out. But I talked to Kyle Griffin. He was talking about the time from please to thanks, and measuring how long it takes from the time that somebody asks for a new feature or reports a bug until you actually fix it and get it in their hands.
Yeah.
And that measuring that amount of time tells you a lot about how a company works
Yes.
internally. Like, does it take 6 months or a year, or does it take a few days or hours or weeks, or what timeline you measure that on makes a huge difference.
I couldn't agree more, because it would, to circle back to my example, it would show that between coding and testing and then changing the things that you did, there was an awful lot amount of time, like more than a month in there. And so between testing and coding and testing, having a month in between, that's like an eternity. I can rewrite my code at that point because I simply don't know what I did a month before. So you're wasting time and money, and it's basically your own time and money that you're burning there.
Yeah. Well, also the interesting thing I've been thinking about is when you shrink this down, it changes what you think about and what you optimize for, and like planning stuff. Like, I work on like weekly sprints. Like, it would be insane to me to start a feature and say this feature is not going to be done for like 3 months, right?
Yeah.
Because I would immediately take that down and say, well, what can I do in a week, right? And start like breaking it down to smaller pieces and chunking it. And like, also like somebody was talking about like one of the topics that always comes up is like scope creep, and how scope creep is this horrible thing, right? And I think that comes from that very waterfall world. Because when we meet every week and we prioritize stuff, the priorities change. That's not scope creep, right? Like,
No.
there's no idea of scope, right? It's like we're just working on this thing that you want to get done, and we're, what that is it's like changing the end goal. Okay, our end goal was here, and now we want to move it over there a little bit or move it a little further. That's fine. Like that
I
doesn't
think too. Yeah.
keep working weekly until we get there.
Yeah.
So,
I think, and since we're talking about measuring time, I think I think it's called the State of DevOps report, and what they're doing is rather a scientific questionnaire to a couple thousand developers out there about DevOps and how they think DevOps is working in their company. And what has been shown from 2019 to 2021 in that report, and I find that pretty interesting, is the lead time, so the time it takes for processing that request that you talked before from where it gets into the system to being done, from the from the best performers as companies when it comes to revenue and so on, to the worst performers. There was a difference in 2019 of 106 times. So people that said we are really good at DevOps and we know what we're doing and we're applying all these techniques, we're having a 106 times faster lead time, saying from where we start and where we finish, compared to 2021, where there was over a 6,000 times increase in lead time. So actually, it showed the more you apply DevOps, so the more you make the process lean and go with the Kanban method that you just said. Look, we take work as it is and we deploy it as fast as we can. Those people got even better compared to the worst performers who got even slower. So this is a great measure how your company like lets new features release to the outside world.
what always amazes me when we talk about things like this is how companies can be very successful in spite of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are some companies that you go to and you just look at their processes and you're just like, wow, how does this even work? And they must just have like huge margins or something, because it just like somehow they seem to stay in business and it seems to stay afloat, and you're just like, I don't understand.
Yeah. And I think I I'm working in a company where there's probably not enough processes where people rely on their network. But then we come to a customer side and you're saying, look, you can't simply do that. You have to get the approval from that point. And I'm like, but this guy doesn't know me and he doesn't know what I do. So how should he judge the quality and the necessity of what I'm doing? And so they put in these barriers, and I think that is really a strange thing, just to keep up a face of authority sometimes, and not to step on anybody's toes. And I think that holds back companies a lot.
Yeah, that just speaks of like a lack of trust. There's a book, and I haven't read it, but I've heard good things about it, called The Speed of Trust. I think it's by Stephen Covey. And
Yeah.
this title like implies that, like, because when, like, the whole thing with like pull requests and code reviews and all that, and like, I don't know if you guys do those or not, but I just view those as like obstacles that like slow me down. And
I
maybe,
I have mixed feelings on pull requests. I'm on one side, I'm absolutely with you. But so what pains me anyway is a LabVIEW pull request, Um, so every time I get a LabVIEW pull request, I have to check out that feature and then open the project and see what has been done. And I don't use the diff and merge tool because I never made that work somehow. It's just a pain for me. So for me, I'm completely with you. A LabVIEW pull request is completely obsolete because if there's a good documentation with the pull request, I simply approve it. There's too much work involved.
Yeah. We should talk afterwards about the merge tool. I have a way to actually make that work, but it is painful. And I had a meeting with some guys from, I think it was Lockheed or one of the big contractors out here, the aerospace guys.
Yeah.
They were really complaining, and they were like, ready to leave NI because in Python, right, any text-based language, somebody submits a pull request, you can go on GitHub or GitLab and you can see a text diff in the editor. You don't have to do anything. You can do that. If you have tests and the test ran, you can look at the test results and say the test passed, and you just click OK, and that's it. It's done. And the person doing the review doesn't even have to be a programmer, really, right? They can just look at it and kind of get an idea of what changed and see the test pass and say, great, you changed what we wanted. That's it. In LabVIEW, like you said, there's nothing you can do meaningfully in the browser. Like there's some stuff out there to generate images, but it takes forever and the images aren't all that useful. And you get even when you get the merge tool working, you get a lot of noise because like, oh, this thing moved 1 pixel. Well, okay, I really don't give a shit about that. Like, right? Unless it's on the front panel, in this case, maybe I care, but like half the front panels, nobody sees any.
Not, yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, and it's this big, huge pain in the butt thing. And they were trying to figure out how to do that. And I was like, I don't have an answer. Like there's no, so.
I mean, I really played with the thought of having a pre-commit hook that takes the changed files and exports at least, the block diagrams as an image. And then you can compare at least image before and image after. But I haven't gotten to that implementation anywhere yet.
There are image compare tools, so that would be one way to do it. Would be to take a snapshot and just do an image compare tool. But the LabVIEW merge tool itself, there is a hidden XM or hidden property node or invoke node, and you can generate that report. And you can generate a web report that will generate a web page that will show you all of that. Darren and I played around with that.
Okay,
it's not as useful as you would think it is, but it's better than nothing. So there's definitely some projects. I want to say. There was an NI project either around Decaf or Veristand or one of those that's on GitHub that had some stuff that did some pull request stuff like that.
Okay.
And talking to some people, I think it took a while because if you got a lot of changes, you're generating a lot of images, and generating the images takes a while, and then you got to upload them, and they're heavy and expensive to upload, and so it just kind of caused a lot more problems than it solved, I think. But
yeah, probably. But you see, this is the pain where I would expect like when I pay for LabVIEW, then probably NI or now Emerson should make that pain go away. But on the other hand, I really don't know how much they will further invest in developer experience.
Yeah.
I'm really doubtful there.
Well, the problem with NI, the big problem is they have the Stephen Mercer calls it the two-hump camel, and basically you've got a large part of their target market is the university kids sitting in the lab with an oscilloscope taking a few readings, right? And they don't need to know a lot. And then there's the rest of us who are doing really big, huge projects. And I just don't think NI understands our needs very well. And also NI has this habit of doing like the 80% solution and then just washing their hands and walking away. And, okay, but like, they're like, go figure it out on your own. But the problem is because it's proprietary, like we can't figure it out on our own. Like we're just stuck with what you gave us, and we can find workarounds or whatever. But which is part of the reason why it would be really nice if a lot of their stuff was open source. So that when they stopped at the 80%, we could then go look at it and say, okay, well, you got this 80% of the way. Let us add on to it, and let's add the extra 20% that we need.
But I mean, I think the community would be out there. I mean, there are so many people, and imagine there's a bug out there, and you don't have to report it. You have somebody who knows enough about the code to see which function produces that error, and then you simply do a small pull request and say, look, dear NI, please review that. I know this is where the error is, and this is the solution to it. That would be. I think that would have been a super smart move like years ago.
Yeah. Well, I think that goes back to the shared pain problem, right? NI makes the decisions about what 80% they're going to make, and then they don't feel the pain of the missing parts, and we do, but our pain is not motivating to them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I can second that, because I come from NI and I had no clue what it was to finish a project, like from start. And this is where like everybody was super helpful. I was system engineer, so pre-sales for some time. And of course we're helpful at pre-sales. And this is where to get you going to whatever and whatnot, any help that was there. But then the last 20%, there's nobody there to help you all the way. And there's also, and this is where I completely agree with you. Coming from an NI perspective, there is nobody that did the project from the beginning till the very end until you hand it off to production. And I don't know how many hours you spent on compiler errors, for example. So you build the exe and you have no freaking clue in the end why the run error is broken. There is simply no way to know it. I mean, that turned out, I think it was Levy 2017 or 2018, when we decided for the first time to use VIMs. It turned into an 8-hour exercise where we removed each single VIM on production side, because it turned out that it was one of the VIMs that made the build break. So, and imagine standing there beside the customer. They were ready for factory acceptance test, and we said, look, we need another day to get rid of all VIMs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where that whole continuous delivery thing also comes into play. Even if you're not delivering directly to your customer, building the executable early and often catches a lot of those problems. Although there are some weird things like you just mentioned where the executable can build but not run. Those are weird, interesting bugs. Because you think like, okay, it builds, everybody's great. And then you go run it, like, oh, this is missing, that's missing, can't find this. Yeah. First time I ran into that, I was like, what do you mean? I was like, it built, it should be fine. And no.
Yeah. So and I think this is where they are lacking. So they by they I mean NI is lacking the experience, because they haven't gone through that pain often enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's the feel the pain or something. I don't know, maybe that'd be a good title, Taylor. Something about, shared pain leads to motivation or something. I don't know. Something along those lines, maybe, or
probably
sharing the pain motivates you to do better. All right, well, it's been a great conversation. We're a little over an hour. Norm will be happy. Norm's always telling me we need longer episodes, so this one's for you, Norm. But we should probably wrap it up. Any last minute thoughts, or?
I think we had covered pretty much. So, but really, I think my colleague Corinne this lunch told me, look, when it comes to bullshit bingo from companies, I think DevOps is more valuable than Scrum or Agile development. I think that sums it up a little bit.
Yeah, very good. All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. It was a great pleasure.
That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @TheLVExperiment.